One accent, one cruel laugh, and one moment that turned humiliation into the company's biggest revelation. The afternoon sun poured through the office's towering glass windows, washing the room in a soft golden glow that danced across the polished conference table. It was midday, the hour when the city outside hummed with restless energy cars, honking, footsteps echoing on sidewalks, fragments of conversations floating up from the street below. But inside the office, there was only the shuffle of papers, the faint click of keyboards, and the low murmur of voices. Preparing for the most important meeting of the quarter, employees were gathered in clusters around the table, some leaning forward with nervous anticipation, others slouched back in their chairs trying to mask their unease. The CEO had promised a critical announcement, and the weight of expectation pressed on every shoulder in the room. Yet amid the quiet tension, one voice rose above the others, not because it was loud, but because it carried a unique rhythm, a sound that drew attention the moment it spoke. It was David's. David sat near the end of the table, posture straight, his notes meticulously arranged before him. He was soft-spoken, but there was a precision in the way he chose his words, as though each one was carefully measured before it left his lips. His tone was calm, respectful, professional, but undeniably colored by the accent of his homeland. His vowels lingered longer, his consonants sometimes sharper than the native speakers around him. To most, it was simply part of who he was, an echo of his story, of where he came from, of the journey that had brought him into this gleaming corporate tower. But not everyone saw it that way. Across the table, Mark sat with his arms folded, eyes narrowed, with impatience. He was the kind of man who believed volume equaled authority. That charm could mask arrogance. As David explained the detail of the client proposal, Mark's lips curled into a smirk. He tilted his head toward a colleague beside him, as if sharing a private joke, and then quiet enough to seem casual, but loud enough for nearby ears to catch. He imitated David's accent under his breath. The sound was sharp, mocking, exaggerated. A few chuckles bubbled up from the corner of the room, awkward and stifled, but there nonetheless. One man coughed into his fist to disguise his laugh. Another looked down at her papers, eyes darting away as guilt prickled at her conscience. David heard it. Of course, he did. His hand, which had been steady as he flipped a page of notes, hesitated for just a fraction of a second. His shoulders stiffened, his chest tightened, but then, with quiet resolve, he continued. His voice did not waver. If anything, he spoke more clearly, as though the act of disrespect only sharpened his determination. Yet inside, the sting was real. Words, even whispered mockery, carried weight. They had a way of pressing against old wounds, of reminding him of the countless times he had been reduced not to his ideas, not to his skill, but to the way his words sounded. Across the room, Mark rolled his eyes dramatically, leaning back in his chair with the self-satisfied grin of someone who thought himself clever. He repeated the accent once more, a little louder this time, nudging the man beside him. The colleague's uneasy laugh hung in the air like a sour note, tainting the atmosphere of the entire room. But David did not look at him. He refused to give him that victory. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on his notes, his pen gliding across the page as though nothing had happened. Yet the air in the room shifted. Tension grew, unspoken but palpable. Some of the employees glanced between the two men, sensing the cruelty in Mark's behavior, the dignity in David's restraint. The sunlight streamed brighter, almost spotlighting David as he spoke again, outlining the key strategies with quiet confidence. There was something unshakable in him, something that no mockery could erode. He was not here to entertain laughter. He was here to contribute, to build, to lead. Still, Mark's smirk lingered, smug and unrepentant. To him, the accent was a weakness, a flaw to be ridiculed. He couldn't see, at least not yet, that it was a mark of resilience, a voice that carried more history, more strength, and more meaning than he could begin to understand. And as the room prepared for the CEO's arrival, a subtle shift in the air seemed to foreshadow that the balance of power, the unspoken hierarchy, was about to change in ways Mark could never have anticipated. David straightened his notes one final time, the faintest flicker of resolve in his eyes. He knew what was coming. The others didn't. Not yet, but soon. The sound of Mark's laugh, low and cutting, still lingered in the air like smoke. David heard it clearly this time. There was no mistaking it. His body stiffened, a quiet armor rising against the sting of ridicule. For a split second, the Warmth of the sun through the glass window seemed colder, harsher, as though the very light had shifted. But outwardly, David did not falter. He continued with the same calm cadence, his words deliberate, his tone steady, his accent wrapped around, each syllable like a thread woven through fabric. To him, it was nothing strange, it was his voice, his truth. But to Mark, it was a target. Leaning forward now, Mark bent toward the man beside him, a cruel smirk pulling at his mouth. This time, he didn't bother to whisper so quietly. He repeated David's words in a mocking sing-song imitation, dragging out the vowels, distorting the consonants until they sounded like a caricature. The cruelty wasn't hidden anymore. A ripple ran through the room. The woman across the table shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes flicking down at her notepad. The man next to her rubbed the bridge of his nose, lips pressed tight as though holding back a protest he didn't dare voice. One employee bit the inside of her cheek, guilt burning behind her silence. They all felt it, the wrongness, the sharp edge of Mark's disrespect, yet none of them spoke. Silence, sometimes, can cut sharper than words. David knew this silence well. He had grown used to it in classrooms, in airports, in boardrooms, those moments when people chose to watch rather than intervene, when discomfort was easier than confrontation. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him now, their unease, hanging heavy in the air, yet he said nothing. He did not raise his voice. He did not lash out. Instead, he simply adjusted the papers in front of him, fingers deliberate, movements controlled. His chest rose and fell slowly as he drew in a steadying breath. He had learned long ago that dignity was not about the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain dictate action. Mark, however, mistook David's composure for weakness. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for a few others to hear. We're supposed to impress a client with that. The words slipped into the room like poison, seeping into the silence. A couple of people shifted again, eyes darting to David, then quickly away. No one corrected him. No one challenged him. David let the words pass, but his heart tightened. Not because he doubted himself, no. He knew the strength he carried, knew the work he had done to be in that room, but because he had seen this story too many times. The mockery, the whispers, the easy dismissal of value simply because it was dressed in difference. And yet, behind his calm exterior, there was something else. A quiet flicker, a sense of knowing. When he glanced toward the conference room door, his gaze lingered longer than necessary. To anyone else, it might have seemed casual, a fleeting glance, but in David's eyes there was something more, an unspoken certainty, a subtle awareness, as though he knew something the others did not. The faint tick of the clock on the wall seemed louder now, each second stretching. The room was waiting for the CEO, waiting for the meeting to begin, waiting for the shift none of them could yet see. Mark leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen on the table with a smug rhythm. His laughter had faded, but the echo of it remained in his posture, in the curve of his grin. He looked at David, the way a predator sizes up prey, confident, careless, assured of dominance. But David did not look back. Instead, he kept his eyes on his notes. Though his thoughts were elsewhere, he could feel the moment approaching, like a current pulling beneath the surface of calm waters. The others might not have noticed, but he did. He knew. The meeting about to unfold was not just about numbers and proposals. It was about something larger, something Mark could not yet imagine. David allowed himself the faintest exhale, a quiet sigh that released some of the tension coiled in his chest. He straightened his shoulders, his expression neutral but resolute. The conference room door remained closed, but it loomed in the background like a stage curtain waiting to be drawn. Behind it, footsteps would soon echo. Behind it, the shape of the future was already forming. And in that silence before the storm, David sat in calm stillness, a man underestimated, a voice dismissed. But the room did not yet know the truth. The very accent mocked only moments ago would soon become the thread that held the entire meeting together. And Mark, the one who laughed the loudest, would soon be the one forced into silence. The minutes stretched like hours, the air inside the glass-walled conference room heavy with an anticipation that none of them could quite name. The clock's second hand ticked forward with relentless precision, each movement a reminder that the CEO would arrive at any moment. A soft murmur began to ripple across the room, whispers hushed but persistent, like wind rustling through dry leaves. "They say she's bringing someone today," one voice muttered near the back. low enough to suggest secrecy, but loud enough for others to catch. An international guest. Another added, the words colored with both curiosity and apprehension. Someone important. I heard they're flying in just for this deal. Heads turned subtly. Eyes darted toward the door, then toward each other. The mention of an international guest had stirred something different in the group, a blend of nerves and curiosity, perhaps even intimidation. Everyone knew how much the CEO valued global partnerships. This wasn't just another meeting. This was a showcase. A staged. And every detail mattered. Mark leaned further back in his chair, a self-satisfied grin stretching across his face. He tapped his pen lazily against his notepad, exuding the kind of arrogance that cloaked itself as confidence. His smirk had not left him since mocking David's accent earlier, as though he believed he had already secured his place above him in the invisible hierarchy of the room. An international guest, huh? Mark whispered to the man beside him, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Well, I hope they can actually understand what's being said in this meeting. He exaggerated the last words. Raising his brows toward David without naming him, the man shifted uneasily, lips pressed tight. He didn't respond. He couldn't. The jab hung in the air like a bitter aftertaste, sour and heavy. David, at the other end of the table, did not rise to the bait. He sat with quiet composure, his posture straight, his hands steady as they moved. Across the papers before him, his notes were neatly aligned, his pen perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. To an outside eye, the gestures might have seemed trivial, but to him, they were deliberate small rituals of order and calming. A world that often tried to reduce him to chaos. There was no trace of resentment on his face, no sign of the sharp words he could have unleashed in his defense. Instead, there was focus, a calm resolve that seemed, strangely, out of place in the simmering tension of the room. Yet beneath that calm, there was something else, a knowing. David's eyes flickered once more to the conference room door, lingering just long enough to betray the faintest hint of anticipation. It wasn't nervousness. It wasn't fear. It was the quiet confidence of someone who understood that the story was not yet finished. That judgment delivered as soon would crumble under the weight of what was about to come. But no one else noticed. They were too preoccupied with their own anxieties, with the whispers that spread like fire from one end of the table to the other. Do you think it's a partner? Someone asked. Or an investor? Another replied. I heard she's been negotiating with overseas clients for weeks. Speculation spiraled, wrapping the room in invisible threads of mystery. Each whisper carried both hope and dread. The arrival of an international guest meant opportunity, but it also meant scrutiny. Every word spoken, every presentation given would be magnified, dissected, remembered. Mark, however, seemed immune to the tension. His smirk only deepened, his arrogance shielding him from the weight pressing down on the others. He glanced once more at David, dismissive, condescending. To him, David was already beneath notice. And yet, the contrast between them grew sharper by the minute. David's quiet movements spoke volumes. His calm wasn't the arrogance of someone who thought himself untouchable. It was the strength of someone who had weathered storms before. Where Mark's confidence was brittle, fragile, propped up by mockery and ego, David's composure was rooted, unshakable. The hum of the city outside seemed distant now, muffled by the tension inside the room. All that mattered was the moment about to arrive, the door about to open. David stacked his documents carefully, aligning the edges with precision. His fingers brushed over the smooth surface of the paper, grounding himself in the small task. He had prepared for this meeting not just with notes and numbers, but with patience, with resilience, with an understanding that the world often misjudged men who sounded like him. And while others fidgeted in their seats, biting their nails or glancing at the clock, David simply waited. The faintest smile, barely perceptible, touched the corner of his lips, not of arrogance, not of superiority, but of someone who saw further ahead than those around him. Someone who knew the tide was about to shift. The door remained closed, but already it seemed to pulse with promise, with the weight of what lay behind it. Soon, the whispers would be silenced. Soon, the smirk would fade. Soon, the truth would unfold in a way none of them expected. And David, calm, focused, unwavering, sat ready for the moment when the curtain would finally lift. The heavy silence of anticipation broke with a sudden click of heels against the polished floor outside. The muffled footsteps drew nearer, steady and purposeful, until the glass door to the conference room flung open. The CEO stepped in. Tall, poised, radiating a quiet authority. She carried with her an energy that immediately shifted the room. Conversations cut short, whispers evaporated, and every employee straightened in their chair as though a string had been pulled through their spine. Her sharp eyes swept across the table, registering everything: the neat stacks of paper, the nervous faces, the too quick smiles. But she wasn't alone. At her side walked a man whose presence seemed to command attention without a word. Distinguished in posture, with silver streaking his dark hair, he carried himself with the ease of someone who had been in countless boardrooms around the world. His suit was perfectly tailored, but it was his gaze steady, observant, that seemed to quiet the very air around him. The whispers about an international guest had been true, and now the reality of it hung heavy in the room. The CEO gestured gracefully. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Mr. Atwell. He's flown in from Lagos to finalize our partnership negotiations." A ripple of awe moved through the employees. Heads nodded, hands tightened around pens, and the room seemed to inhale collectively. This was bigger than they'd expected. Mark leaned forward, his smirk returning faintly, as though he believed this was his chance to shine. He straightened his tie, preparing to make himself noticed, certain that his charm could carry him through. But then it happened. The distinguished guest's eyes swept across the table and stopped. They locked on David Dot, and in an instant, the stillness broke, with a broad smile that reached his eyes. Mr. Atwell stepped past the others and greeted David in a warm, melodic voice, words flowing not in English, but in the rich cadence of David's native tongue. The very same accent that had been mocked minutes earlier now filled the room with power and grace. The sound was unmistakable. Every head turned, eyes widening. Shock rippled through the team like a wave. David rose slowly, calm and composed, as though this moment had been waiting for him all along. Without hesitation, he responded in the same language, his voice carrying confidence, fluidity, and respect. The words rolled off his tongue with ease, natural and unforced, weaving a bridge between continents in the space of a breath. The contrast was staggering. Only moments ago, his accent had been treated like a weakness. Now, it filled the room with strength, drawing admiration, not ridicule. As David switched seamlessly between his mother tongue and English, his poise never faltered. He welcomed Mr. Atwell warmly, then transitioned into clarifying points about the partnership with practiced fluency. His presence transformed no longer just another employee at the table, but the keystone holding the moment together. The CEO's voice cut into the stunned silence, deliberate and clear. "David has been instrumental in securing this partnership. Without him, we wouldn't even be in this room today. He's the only one here who can bridge our communication smoothly." Her words landed like a thunderclap. All eyes shifted to David again. But this time, there was no laughter, no mockery. Only respect tinged with shame in some faces, surprise in others. Mark's smirk collapsed. It was as if someone had ripped the ground from beneath him. His jaw slackened. His pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. The noise seemed to echo louder than it should have, drawing more eyes toward him. His cheeks flushed crimson. Heat rushed into his face as the weight of the moment bore down on him. The very accent he had mocked so casually, so cruelly, was now the centerpiece of admiration. The very key to the company's most important deal. His laughter, only minutes old, felt grotesque and hollow in hindsight. Small, petty, humiliating. The room seemed to shrink around him. His colleagues, the same ones who had chuckled at his jokes, now avoided his gaze. Their silence, once complicity, now turned into quiet condemnation. He could feel it, the judgment, the disappointment, the shame of having revealed himself so completely. Across the table, David stood tall, not boastful, not vengeful, simply dignified. His calm presence was louder than any defense he could have spoken, louder than any rebuke he might have hurled. For a brief second, their eyes met. Mark's gaze flickered downward, unable to hold the weight of David's steady calm. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Where Mark once believed himself above, he now found himself diminished, dwarfed not by arrogance or force, but by the undeniable truth of David's worth. And as David continued the conversation with Mr. Atwell, his words flowing effortlessly, the room seemed to breathe again. The energy shifted from tension to awe, from silence to admiration. The accent that had once been mocked now filled the air like music, commanding respect with every syllable. And Mark, for the first time that day, sat in silence. The room had shifted. Where there had once been whispers and uneasy laughter, Now there was silence, and attentive, reverent silence that followed every word leaving David's lips. He stood at the head of the table now, no longer the quiet man at the edge of the room, but the center. His papers were spread neatly before him, yet he hardly needed them. His voice calm, steady, confident, carried the weight of knowledge and the grace of fluency. Switching effortlessly between English and his native tongue, David translated with precision, bridging ideas that would have otherwise been lost in the fog of cultural gaps. His cadence was smooth, his gestures deliberate, his tone respectful, but assured. Each word seemed to weave a stronger thread between the CEO and her guest, binding them closer to the future they both envisioned. Your proposal reflects a deep understanding of our markets, David relayed to the guest in English, then turned and repeated the thought in their shared language, his voice warm, resonant. He wasn't just translating words, he was translating intent, nuance, trust. The CEO's eyes shone with approval. Her posture was proud, her smile widening with each exchange. She leaned slightly toward the distinguished guest, but her gaze often flickered back to David, as though silently acknowledging that he was the axis on which this entire negotiation turned out. The guest, Mr. Adwale, beamed with delight. His laughter rang out full and genuine as David conveyed a subtle joke in his native tongue that carried far more weight than a simple translation could have offered. He leaned forward, nodding vigorously, his respect for David playing in every movement. The atmosphere in the room transformed. The employees, who had once sat tense and uncertain, now leaned with rapt attention. Their pens scribbled frantically, their eyes flicked between David, the CEO, and the guest, realizing with dawning clarity that they were witnessing something rare, something pivotal. And then there was Mark. He sat frozen in his chair, the smug tilt of his chin long gone. His face had drained of color, then slowly flushed hot, a mottled red creeping up his neck to his cheeks. He didn't dare speak, didn't dare move. His hands, which usually gestured with confidence, now sat stiff on the table, fingers clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every word David spoke was a hammer, driving deeper the truth Mark could no longer deny. The very accent he had mocked was the key opening doors none of them could have entered without David. The sound he had turned into a cheap joke was now the music of opportunity, resonating through the room with undeniable strength, and others knew it too. Slowly, cautiously, colleagues began to shift their gaze toward Mark, not openly hostile, just steady, knowing. Their eyes spoke volumes, carrying a silent judgment he could not escape. Some looked at him with quiet disappointment, others with thinly veiled disdain. Even those who had chuckled at his earlier mockery now seemed ashamed of themselves. Their faces flushed as they remembered their complicit laughter. Mark's chest tightened. He wanted to sink into the floor, to vanish beneath the weight of their stares. He wanted to rewind the clock, to snatch back the words he had flung so carelessly. But it was too late. The silence of his colleagues was no longer the silence of avoidance, it was the silence of judgment, of exposure. David's voice filled the space again, unbothered by the drama unraveling at the other end of the table. He outlined a framework for collaboration, translating complex terms into simpler ones without losing their depth. His gestures were elegant, his tone unwavering. He was not performing for applause, not seeking vindication. He was simply doing his work, and doing it with excellence. But that was what made the difference cut deeper. David didn't need to humiliate Mark. He didn't need to gloat or sneer. His very existence, his poise, his fluency, his dignity was enough to make Mark's mockery look small, childish, grotesque. At one point, the guest leaned across the table, clasping David's hand warmly. His words were effusive, thick with gratitude. David smiled, responded in kind, and then turned smoothly to translate for the CEO, whose eyes softened with visible pride. The sound of applause broke out then, not formal, but spontaneous, from the guest himself. Even the CEO chuckled warmly, adding, "This, everyone, is what true leadership looks like." The words landed like stones in Mark's chest. Leadership, a word he had always reserved for himself, always imagined attached to his name. Now it belonged to the man he had ridiculed, and the irony burned hotter than fire. Mark stared down at the polished surface of the table, his own reflection blurred and warped by the light. He couldn't meet anyone's gaze. He couldn't even trust his own voice not to crack if he spoke. The meeting carried on without him, as though he no longer mattered. And in a way, he didn't. For the first time, Mark realized what it meant to be invisible, not because of an accent, not because of background, but because of a relevance. And beside him, David's voice carried forward with clarity, filling the room, bridging worlds, reshaping futures. The accent once mocked was now immortalized in memory as the sound of success, and Mark, small, silent, shame, sat trapped in the cage of his own regret. The meeting drew to a close, but the air in the conference room still vibrated with the power of what had just unfolded. The guests' laughter lingered like music, his words of gratitude echoing softly even after they ended. The CEO sat straighter in her chair, her pen resting idle on her notes. She wasn't writing anymore. There was nothing left to write. The deal was alive, flourishing, and it was thanks to one person. As the employees began to shift in their seats, shuffling papers, and exhaling the breaths they had been holding, the CEO spoke again. Her voice was calm, but carried the authority that always demanded attention. Before we wrap up, she said, her gaze sweeping slowly across the room, I need to acknowledge something important. The room fell into silence once more. Her eyes settled on David. Your voice, she said firmly, pausing as though to weigh the words, is a strength, not a weakness. It is the bridge that connected us today, the reason this partnership has taken shape. And I want everyone in this room to remember that. The words struck like a bell, reverberating deep into every corner of the conference room. Some employees nodded instinctively, their faces softened with admiration. Others lowered their eyes, ashamed of the silence they had allowed earlier. David stood, not because he was asked to, but because it felt right. His shoulders relaxed, his posture graceful. A faint smile touched his lips, warm and humble, not triumphant, not gloating. It wasn't the smile of a man reveling in victory over those who doubted him. It was the smile of quiet dignity, of someone who knew his worth long before anyone else recognized it. He gave a slight bow of his head to the CEO, then to the guest. Thank you, he said simply, his accent wrapping around the words with unmistakable richness. There was no need for more. His work had spoken louder than anything else could. At the far end of the table, Mark sat rigid, his chest heavy with a weight he couldn't shake. His once bright smirk was gone, replaced by a hollow ache that pressed against his ribs. The CEO's words were meant as praise for David, but to Mark, they burned like an indictment. Each syllable echoed back at him, replaying his earlier mockery, his whispered imitations, his crow laughter. He lowered his head, eyes fixed on the table as shame gnawed at him. The grain of the polish wood blurred under his gaze, distorted by the sting of regret. His colleagues' earlier looks of judgment returned in his mind like ghosts, silent, condemning. He wanted to apologize, to undo what had been done, but no words came. Even if they did, he knew they would sound hollow. His laughter could not be erased. His arrogance could not be hidden. The truth had been laid bare in front of everyone. David had risen above, not through confrontation or anger, but through quiet excellence. And that, more than anything, left Mark feeling small. The CEO stood then, signaling the official end of the meeting. Papers shuffled louder this time. Chairs scraped against the floor, but the energy was different. People lingered near David, offering handshakes, nods of respect, soft words of praise. The guests clapped him on the back warmly, still speaking in their shared language with joy that needed no translation. David accepted it all with calm grace. He smiled. He nodded, but he never flaunted. He had nothing to prove. Mark remained in his chair, invisible now in the swell of admiration surrounding the man he had mocked. He pressed his palms together tightly, trying to steady the sinking feeling in his gut. His chest was heavy with a truth he could no longer escape. The joke he thought so clever had only revealed his own ignorance. When the room finally began to clear, David gathered his papers with the same calm precision he had shown all along. He didn't look at Mark, not once, not out of malice, but because he didn't need to. Some victories require no acknowledgement. They exist in silence, in dignity, in knowing. Mark lifted his eyes briefly as David passed, hoping for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe recognition. But David's gaze was forward, his stride steady, his smile still faint. There was no gloating, no bitterness, only quiet strength. And that, Mark realized, was what hurt the most. The door closed softly behind them, and the echo of it seemed to whisper the lesson that hung heavy in the air, a truth every person in that room would carry long after they left. Never mock what you don't understand. What you laugh at today might be the very thing that saves you tomorrow. For David, his accent was never a weakness, it was a bridge, a story, a strength. For Mark, it was a mirror, reflecting back the smallness of cruelty, the hollowness of pride, and in that conference room, beneath the fading glow of the afternoon sun, the line between mockery and respect had been drawn forever.